So the subject of today's talk is the book that just came out in late November from Cambria Press, which is called Parallel Journeys. It's the one on the left up there. And if you're interested, I'll sell you a copy later today, and I can sign it too, as well as some of my other books that I brought out here on the podium. And so the title of today's talk was the original title I had for the book before the press, and I sort of changed it a bit. It was Beyond the Mountains and Seas, Eurasian History Through Travelers' Eyes. So let me have to get close. This is not. Okay. So let's see how far away we can do this. You have to be that close. Okay. All right, so the standard sort of history of Eurasia is usually told from a Eurocentric perspective, from a Western-centric perspective. And it usually begins with the campaigns of Alexander the Great around 330 BC as he goes all the way to Afghanistan. It then continues with the Roman Indian Ocean trade network to India and beyond. Then it's followed by a discussion of the Arab domination of the maritime sea routes, and then the so-called revelation of Cathay of William of Rubric and Marco Polo. And that's usually followed then by a discussion of the voyages of discovery and Vasco da Gama. And then we get the discussion of usually the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British trade empires, the East India companies, followed by Western imperialism and a Chinese response, and the Opium Wars, of course. And then it usually ends with modernization on Western terms. So this is the sort of standard Eurocentric history of Eurasia. So what I set out to do, though, was tell a more balanced story. And so how do we tell a truly global history, a balanced global history? And so I was inspired by the Roman period Greek author Plutarch, who wrote the book Parallel Lives, which juxtaposed biographies of one Greek and one Roman personage, like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And he wrote parallel biographies, and this allowed him to see sort of the parallel tracks in their lives and how their personal character explained their fate, their historical fate. And so what I did for this history was take a pair of travelers, one going from east to west and one going from west to east, and put them under one time period, one historical era. And then this allowed the conversation between the two travelers to shed more light on the connected history of Eurasia. And so I'll get to a few of these and sort of why I paired them. But this allows us to see the history of Eurasia as a connected story, not a sort of one-sided story with an active west and a passive east. Yeah, I wish this remote was actually close enough to advance the slides. And so in the introduction, I also do a sort of literary analysis and look at the travel account as a literary genre. It's really a subgenre of the hero's journey. So in each of these travelers, they usually encounter some difficulty and they cross some great liminal space, which is usually the mountains, the deserts, the seas. That's why I call this Beyond the Mountains and Seas. And then when they get to the other side, they encounter the alien, right? The foreign, the other. And so they encounter the ultimate other, and therefore they then understand themselves in a different way. They bring this knowledge back and they can reflect on the self. And so it's a transformation like the hero's journey after some very difficult ordeal. And we see that genre in both the Eastern and the Western accounts. So if we're going to look at this East and West on a map, we can see that there's basically three different ways that you can go east and west during this time period. So there's two different land routes. The northern route is the steppe route, and so it goes from Mongolia and Manchuria over the Kazakh steppe and eventually over the Caspian to the Black Sea. That's the route that, of course, the Mongols would go, the route that William of Rubric would take. The more traditional Silk Route is the one that starts in the Chinese capital at Chang'an, where Xi'an is today, goes through the Taklamakan deserts, over the Pamir Mountains, into Afghanistan, and eventually across into Syria. That's the traditional Silk Road. The third way is by sea, and that usually starts in either the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, takes the monsoon winds, which go in different directions depending on the season, to India, around Sri Lanka, and eventually through the Straits of Malacca, and then to South China. So all the travelers in the book take one of those three routes, or sometimes more than one. Marco Polo goes this way and comes back this way.
I will.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
So this is a graphic showing the 28 travelers in the book. So this is a literary anthology with historical introductions of 28 travelers. There's 13 pairs plus a couple extras, some triplings here, and I'll talk about that. And so these are the Western travelers on top here, and these are the Eastern travelers down here, and they're paired in each historical era. And so we'll start with the ancient period, and we'll start at a time period when people aren't really going that far, but there are legends and fears about what's out there. Thank you. So it's called Monsters at the Edge of the World, is the first chapter. So in every human society, before people could literally venture that far, there is a projection of the human psyche that at the edge of the world there are monsters. Not just monsters, but also hybrid human-animal monsters, places with inverted norms, places where, let's say, women rule instead of men, and there's several examples of that. So kind of where human norms are turned upside down. And these are sort of the projection, not only of human fears, but also of human definition. So to define what it is to be human, you have to define what it is to be inhuman. And so the projection of these monsters is a way to define what the community is, to define the human. So we start with two accounts. The first is by Ctesias of Cnidus. He was a Greek physician who was serving the Persian king around 400 BC. And he met travelers coming from India and Bactria. He wrote a book called the Indica, where he explained the marvels of India. Now, he had never been to India. This was all secondhand. And there's a lot of things in it that are monstrous. And I'll show some examples. This is paralleled with a Chinese book from around the same time period called the Shanhai Jing, or the Guideways Through Mountains and Seas. And this was also a sort of mythical geography of all the different directions and the strange beings and deities out in each of those places. So Ctesias is our source for some very famous Western myths, like the unicorn. He said the unicorn has a horn on its forehead, a cubit in length, and it is an antidote to poisonous drugs. He talked about the griffins that live on these gold-bearing mountains in India, and then this fantastic creature called what we call the manticore today, or the marticora, faced like a man, as big as a lion, and had like a stinger tail, like a scorpion to shot arrows at. So all these kind of monsters come from Ctesias. Now, on the Chinese side, the Guideways Through Mountains and Seas, one of the things in the West they describe is a deity called Shiwangmu, or the Queen Mother of the West, who had a human form, a tiger's teeth, a panther's body, and she controlled the sort of plagues and disasters of the cosmos. And also out in the far west was a place called the Country of Women, the Nudzapor. And this was a place where women ruled, and they could get themselves pregnant by just immersing themselves in water without the aid of men. And this is it's not really a mimicking of the Greek Amazon myth, it's a parallel of the kind of gender inversion society that plays on male projected anxieties. Okay, now if we move forward about 100 years or so, 100 to 200 years, we then get to a time period when the empires come in contact. These are when the first empires, East and West, start to expand, and then they sort of run into each other. And so the myths are replaced with diplomacy. And so in this period from 300 to 100 BC, we have in the West the account of a man named Megasthenes, who was sent by the Seleucid monarch to the court of Chandragupta Maurya in India, here at Pataliputra here. So he came from Arachosia to here. And he gives us our first account, realistic account of Indian government and society. And then from the east, we have Zhang Tian, who is sent by the Han court through Mongolia and eventually all the way to Afghanistan to make contact with Western powers to try to get allies in a war. So Megasthenes gives us, instead of the dog-headed men and things we saw in Ctesias, he tells us about the capital, how big it was. He tells us how elephants were trained for the military and how they were tamed. He gives us our first description of the Indian caste system, which is fairly accurate, and he describes the different types of philosophers and Indian philosophy. Now, Zhang Qian had a rough time of it. It took him more than 10 years to get there, because he was captured almost immediately by the Xiongnu and taken to their capital. He was given a wife, he had a child, and 10 years later he managed to break free and make his way to Central Asia. And he had not given up his mission. And so when he was out there, he discovered an entire world that China had been unaware of. A whole world of other sophisticated societies, large state-level societies, including a place they call Dayuan, which is in Uzbekistan, where the wine and their heavenly horses came from. A place called Daxia, which is Bactria in northern Afghanistan, where the Greeks had been ruling. Shandu, which is their first word for India, which was southeast of Daxia, as well as Anxi, which is the Parthian Empire. And he describes their currency and their writing. And he also deduces a way that you could get from China to India by going through the southwest, through Yunnan and Burma. So we're going to skip ahead a few. We're not going to cover all of our travels today. I'm just going to give you a sampling. So if we skip ahead to the medieval period, I want to skip up to the medieval period and look at Arab merchants and their travels to China, and then a Chinese soldier and his time in the Arab capital. So the two men we're talking about here is a man named Du Huan and then a man named Suleiman al-Tajir, Suleiman the merchant, who becomes a sort of grab-all character for a bunch of Arab merchants who travel the route to Canton. Next, please.
Sorry.
Okay, so Du Huan, I call him the reluctant traveler because he was a prisoner of war. He was captured by Arab armies at the Battle of the Talas River in 751, which was the confrontation between Arab and Chinese armies during the Tang Dynasty. And he's brought back under house arrest to the capital of Al-Kufa, which was the capital before Baghdad of the Abbasid Caliphate. And he is the first Chinese eyewitness to the Islamic world, the first description of Islam and its tenets, the first description of anything in the Islamic world. And he is paired with Suleiman al-Tajir and the other merchant accounts in accounts of China and India, which dates from around 851. And this is really the first detailed Arabic or Western account of China of the Tang Dynasty. And so comparing, let's say, their first impressions of the other, what's interesting is Du Huan said the men and women folk in the Arab capital are stalwart and handsome. Their garments are fresh and clean. And Suleiman said the same thing about the Chinese. They said the Chinese are handsome and tall, and they're pure white in color, like us. He said, like us Arabs, they're white in color. So we see a kind of relativity to that sort of racial definition with just a tinge of redness. In terms of culture, of course, you always have to have these shocking accounts of the other in terms of like hygiene or other things and food. And so Suleiman said that it's shocking. The Chinese, they don't wipe their rear ends with water. They use Chinese paper, right? They use toilet paper. And that's shocking because paper is very valuable in the Arab world. It's very new at this point. It would be like using silk or gold to wipe yourself, right? This is Chinese paper. And also shocked that women go about with their hair uncovered. Now, on the opposite end, Du Huan says the same sort of things. He said, a woman leaves the gates, she must conceal her face. But they did admire certain rituals, especially ritual cleansings, the ablutions before prayers. Now, in terms of the faith, Suleiman and his fellow merchants, they said China doesn't even have a native religion. They just borrowed it from India. So what he's talking about, of course, is Buddhism. He said the Chinese don't have a native religion. They just borrowed everything from India. and both countries believe in reincarnation. And in his account, the Arab accounts are often denigrating to India, and they praise China. They think the people in India are dark and dirty and unhealthy, where they think China is white and clean and sophisticated and civilized. So they're always making contrasts between China and India. Now, Du Huan is the first, like I said, description of Islam in China. He describes the 5 prayers. They don't transliterate Allah, they say heaven. They say they pray 5 times a day to heaven. But he's a bit thrown off by the fact that they consider sacrificing an animal to be a pious deed, because from a Chinese perspective, a Buddhist perspective, you would never kill an animal in sacrifice. Okay, we're going to skip over William of Rubric and Rabban Salma, a couple of interesting ones. So when William of Rubric was in Mongolia, a Chinese individual at the same time was in Rome debating the nature of the Trinity with the Pope. And so this is an exact parallel where we have a holy man from the West going east to preach Christianity, and Rabban Salma, who's also a Christian, an Nestorian Christian, is in Rome, even though he was born in Beijing, and he is debating with the Pope and the cardinals. But we're going to skip to the famous guy, Marco Polo, and look at Marco Polo, and parallel him with Zhao Rugua. So Marco Polo, and we'll talk about his sort of description of some of the things. So he's the Venetian traveler who travels in the late 13th century with his father and uncle and serves at the court of Kublai Khan. And in my book, I do spend quite a bit of time talking about the theory that Marco Polo didn't actually go to China, and then countering that with evidence that he did. So Marco Polo definitely traveled a lot of places, not every place he said he did, but a lot of places. He gives some very specific information that couldn't be found anywhere else. And he is paired with a man named Zhao Rugua, who never went anywhere. So Zhao Rugua was the supervisor of maritime trade in the town of Quanzhou, which is in southern China. And what he did is he interviewed all the Arab merchants and foreign merchants who were in the town about their countries. And then he wrote all this down and compiled it into a book. Now, on the outside, it would seem, well, these aren't really comparable, but they were both doing something similar. This was the first time in history when the entire Eastern Hemisphere was connected. The whole Afro-Eurasian continent was connected by trade and diplomacy. And so both of these accounts are descriptions of the world. That's actually the name of Marco Polo's book, is a description of the world. And so they both try to describe the entire known world. And what's interesting is Marco Polo's world is centered on the Mongol domains. It's a Mongol-centered world. Whereas Zhao Rugua's world from 50 years earlier is still an Arabic-centered world, centered on the Abbasid Caliphate, which hadn't been destroyed yet by the Mongols. So the most famous part of Marco Polo's account is his description of what he calls Kinsai, which is modern Hangzhou, which was the largest city in the world. It had over 2 million people, and Marco Polo gives this fantastic description of it. He says, it's a city like Venice. It has 12,000 bridges of stone. There's 1.6 million households, and they use 43 loads of pepper a day, each load being 223 pounds. And so this is what people in the West viewed as complete exaggeration. There's 10,000 people living in Paris at this time. There's about 8,000 people in London. There's 2 million people in this city. So no one believes this. But it's true. Chinese records say there are more than 2 million people living in this area. He also describes paper money for the first time, well, second time. One of the other monks had described it too. And this was also a revelation. It was almost like magic. You're printing money? And so he describes paper money that was used under the Mongol kingdom. And he describes this city as the city of heaven, without fail, the most noble city and the best in the world. So as I mentioned, Zhao Rugua was this supervisor of maritime trade in Quanzhou, which had taken over from Canton, and it was home to a very large Muslim diaspora. There's even a Muslim cemetery in the town. Many tombstones have been found there from this Muslim community. And it was a great converging point for all these traders and all their stories. And so he had his subordinates write down all these stories, and he compiled them into a book. And so here we do get sort of the monsters at the edge of the world, but now that edge of the world is Africa. And so he describes the creatures of Africa in fantastic terms, like the ostrich, which he calls the camel crane, the giraffe, and what he calls the striped mule, which is obviously the zebra. And so he describes these fantastic creatures. And then he describes stuff even further west. He describes northern Africa and Spain in fantastic terms. And my favorite is he describes Mount Etna on Sicily, which he calls Siciliae. So Sicily is near Lume, which is Rome. And he describes this violent volcano. And he said every few years the people push a big rock up to the top and throw it down the volcano and see if it'll blow to pieces. And so, you know, he's obviously never seen a volcano living in South China. So this is sort of the earliest description of a volcano that we get about Mount Etna. But of course, he never went there. This is all sailors' tales that he hears. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to skip some of the Age of Discovery and some of these great travelers here, like Matteo Ricci here, and we're going to skip a little more forward to the early modern period, look at Lord George Macartney and the first Chinese ambassador to England, Guo Songtao. Okay, so the first pairing then is what I call this is the political ambassadors. The next chapter is cultural ambassadors. So we had some of our ancient ambassadors much earlier. So this is two ambassadors in the 18th and 19th century, but with very different missions. So Macartney is sent by the British East India Company and the British government to get trade concessions from the Qing Empire. They want a permanent ambassador in Peking, they want trade ports open, and they think that they can deal on British terms with the Chinese government. And so they're sent to the court of the Qianlong Emperor, and this is Britain at the zenith of its power. Guo Songtao is from almost a century later, when China is at the bottom of its power, and he's sent to England first to apologize because a British envoy got murdered in Yunnan, and then later he's appointed as permanent ambassador to Queen Victoria based on the Chefu Convention. And so they have very different styles, very different missions. Macartney is very confident, quite arrogant. He's very critical of what he considers Chinese backwardness. He sees it as a great monolith which is about to fall apart, like he calls a crazy first-rate man of war, which has been kept afloat by who knows what reason and is about to sink. And he says that China is not advancing, and anything that doesn't advance must go into retrograde and then eventually fall into barbarism. And so he's always making comparisons with European technology and military and saying that China is just not keeping up. And this is this notion of sort of Western progress, and that the East is sort of static. This is what Adam Smith or Georg Hegel, people like that, were saying. And he wanted to use diplomacy. He's trying to use diplomacy, but he hints that they can do it the other way. So we can do it the diplomatic, the gentle way, or we can do it the other way. And he has a long passage that I abstract where he talks about what would happen if we invaded China. And he talks about millions of people would die, and actually trade would deteriorate, so maybe we shouldn't do that. But he's more concerned about the trade decaying than the millions of people dying part. So Guo Songtao, he is sent originally to apologize, but this was really an exile for him because he had been clamoring for reform at home, and they basically said, okay, you want reform, we'll send you to England. And so this was really an exile for him. But when he was there, he decided he was going to analyze why England is strong. Is it just because they have strong weapons, or is there something more fundamental in their political structure and their economy that makes them so powerful? And so the central part of Macartney's account is the wrangling over ritual. And so he was expected to prostrate himself on the ground and knock his head on the ground in front of the Qianlong Emperor, and this is William Alexander's famous watercolor, and he refused to do that. He said he would not prostrate himself on the ground, that he would kneel on one knee like he would do for his own king, George III. And so this led to this great sort of difficulty between the two sides, but eventually he wouldn't yield. And he has a letter here that he's presenting to the emperor asking for these trade concessions. Well, the emperor had already written the response before he even met him. And he had already denied all of his concessions and basically said, we don't want any of your British gadgets, take them all home, no. And so this eventually, of course, led to later conflict. Now, Guo Songtao, he is more adaptable. When he is living in London, he has tea with Queen Victoria, he socializes with women, he integrates with society, but unbeknownst to him, his vice ambassador was actually a spy sent by his enemies to undermine him. And so whenever he did something, his vice ambassador would put stories in the British tabloid press undermining him in his job. And so eventually he's recalled like a year later. Yeah. So we see an interesting comparison when they talk about innovation. So Macartney brings all these examples of European ingenuity. He brings clocks and watches, hot air balloons, phosphorus bottles to light your cigarette, things like that. And no one's interested in them. They don't want a demonstration of the hot air balloon. They just put all this stuff in a cabinet somewhere. And he says, you know, why are they not interested in progress in medicine and all these other things that we've invented? And when Guo Songtao is in London, he chronicles things like the steamship, the telegraph, and the railroad especially, and says, we need to harness this kind of energy. He said, because if we don't, they're going to bring it here. And he shows how already the British were planning a whole railroad system through India all the way into China, whether the Chinese wanted it or not. And so they already had all this mapped out. Now, in terms of the military, Macartney was very dismissive of the Chinese military. He called them slovenly, unwarlike, and effeminate. And he said that they had no fighting capability, their weapons were made of pasteboard, it was just a theatrical display. And he said in his famous phrase, a couple of English frigates would be an overmatch for the whole naval force of their empire, which is exactly what happens 40 years later in the Opium War when they sink the whole Chinese Navy in one afternoon. Now, when Guo Songtao is in London, he notes that it's not just weapons, that their whole military training system is very deep in England. He talks about the sort of medical exams, education, technical instruction, all the things involved in training a British soldier. And Guo Songtao knows something about the military. He fought against the Taiping rebels, he led battles himself, and he was really interested in military training. And the other thing he noticed, of course, was that the Japanese were already there. The Japanese were in London, they were studying everything. They were studying finance and law and the military. They had sent tons of advisors, and China was sending no advisors. And so he was ashamed that China was falling behind Japan. So he talks about the telegraph and how, you know, you can send a message, you know, thousands of miles in an instant. And he said this could actually help the state, that we could actually have closer contact with the people, we could understand what's going on, we could understand problems before they develop, and we could actually put down unrest before it turns into a full rebellion. And he noticed, like I said, the Japanese students who were there studying mining, and then he criticized the people at home who criticized him because they said, well, we don't want railroads, we don't want Western-style coal mining because it'll interrupt the feng shui of the landscape. And he said, that's preposterous. He said, there's coal mining all over the place in South China. What does it matter if you're using Western techniques or Chinese techniques? It's still a hole in the ground, right, for coal. And so he said, you know, these things can make us powerful and defend the state, but people deny them because they think they were going to disrupt the local geomancy. And so Macartney is viewed as sort of a prophet, because even though he didn't get the treaty he wanted, he didn't get any of the concessions he wanted, he did provide crucial intelligence, and later during the Opium Wars, it was true that a few English frigates did destroy the whole Chinese Navy. Guo was sent back in shame. So his account of his journey was destroyed, the blocks were burned, he was declared a traitor, and he wasn't vindicated until after the fall of the Qing. Okay, now we go from the political ambassadors to the cultural ambassadors. And here we get our first female traveler, Eliza Jane Bridgman, and we're going to contrast her with Wang Tao, who is in England. Okay. So Eliza Bridgman is the first American Protestant female missionary in China. And her goal was to bring the gospel to China, and she specifically wanted to help the women of China. And so the name of her book is called The Daughters of China. And her view is unique because all of these male travelers who went to China before her, they didn't have access to the inner chambers, right? So they couldn't actually meet women or see upper class or middle class women. And so she was invited into the homes of women, and she could actually see them in person. So she had a very different perspective than Matteo Ricci or the missionaries or those other figures. So she wanted to lift women what she saw out of ignorance and oppression, and she thought that the devil, the father of lies, had almost undisputed dominion in China. Wang Tao was a Chinese scholar, and he was familiar with missionaries, and he worked with James Legge, who was the man who translated the Chinese classics into English. And he traveled with James Legge to Legge's home in Scotland, and he helped him over a decade before he went back to Hong Kong. And this fueled his career advocating for reform. Yeah. So we'll start with Eliza Bridgman. So she arrived in 1845, and she set up a school for girls. So she wanted to teach girls how to read and write, but also how to do sewing and embroidery and practical things. And she criticized many of the same things that some earlier travelers had criticized, but definitely from a more empathetic perspective. She criticized foot binding as the most barbarous practice. She talked about how the children in her school were wailing in pain from the compression of their feet. And she would ask their parents, can we please untie her feet? And they said no, because then she'll never get married. And so a few families she did convince them to unbind their girls' feet. She also talked about female infanticide, where women, would drown or strangle babies at birth, and talk about, basically what would lead a mother to do that to her own child, knowing that the future that held for that girl. She said it would quench the fire of maternal love. And so she opens her book with this phrase, shall women then be there neglected? Can nothing be done to give her the glorious gospel, to elevate her to her proper sphere? So she views that she's there as a savior. She's there to bring the gospel and to lift people out of oppression. So this is a particularly Christian evangelical viewpoint. And while she's there, she also experiences extreme xenophobia, because this is shortly after the Opium Wars. There's a lot of anti-Western hatred still in South China. So one day, she and her husband and a bunch of others go on a boating excursion. And suddenly, there's these young men on the shore who start throwing rocks at them, get bigger and bigger rocks, eventually a 100-pound boulder that they drop onto the ship. And they yell, "You have killed our people and we will kill you." And so she describes this harrowing journey down the river while these men are trying to, throw rocks at them, and said, the faces of the mob were demon-like, and she attributes this to the workings of the devil. And their young boatman was actually injured, and she talks about how my dress was covered with the blood of the wounded boatman at the end. So we get a kind of Christian crescendo at the end, a sort of blood sacrifice at the end, where she becomes a martyr with the boatman, and his blood is on her dress. So then we get to Wang Tao. So Wang Tao is a scholar, a great Confucian scholar. He comes to China to work with James Legge in Scotland to translate the Confucian classics. And while he's there, he's actually invited to give a speech at Oxford University in Chinese about Eastern and Western sort of spiritual traditions. And just like Eliza Bridgman saw that the gospel could be a way to sort of unite East and West, Wang Tao thought, he used this Confucian concept of the Da Tong, the great unity. And he thought that beneath Confucianism and Christianity was a common spiritual foundation, which could form the basis of a shared understanding between East and West. So some of the things that he was struck by in England was near universal literacy. In China, maybe only 1 or 2% of people could be literate, maybe 10% at the most. But in England at this time, we're approaching 80 to 90% literacy. And so he said the British attached great importance to literacy. Even the lowly workers and crude servants, most of them know how to read and write. And he said that is how you prepare people to manage business operations in the 4 quadrants of their empire. So he said education of everyone is one of the reasons why the British are rich. And then he talks about the marvels of modernity. He talks about trains and bridges and street lamps. And he said every day one is surprised by some novel or ingenious technology. But the thing that really interested him was intellectual property protection. And so he said, what is the incentive to invent if someone's just going to take your invention? He said they have this thing called the patent, that if you invent something, you go to a patent office, you pay a fee, and no one can steal your invention. And he said this is why they have incentive to develop things, because they know they'll make a profit. In China, there's no intellectual property protection, and so why invent anything? So the two of these had very enduring legacies. Eliza Jane Bridgman formed the Bridgman Academy for Girls, which became part of Yenjing University, later Peking University, so it merged into that. And Wang Tao formed the first wholly run Chinese newspaper. And he wrote editorials and travelogues and advocated for reform and introduced Western ideas to a generation of Chinese intellectuals. Okay, then we come to our last grouping. Here, we're going to do a triplet here. So into the 20th century, we're going to have 2 Chinese intellectuals traveling to the west, and we're going to have Edgar Snow traveling to the east. So those earlier travelers in the 19th century, when they traveled to the west, they were sort of admiring the west and looking at, how are they so powerful? How are they so rich? But in the 20th century, we have a more critical view. So we have 2 intellectuals. We have Liang Qichao, the great Chinese intellectual, and we have Shan Shili, a female scholar, one traveling to America in 1903, one traveling to Europe around the same time. But they're looking more critically at the West. They can see then the contradictions. They can see things like racism and inequality and poverty. And they're trying to decide, what should we borrow from the West, if anything? Is it even applicable to China? These are both nationalists. They want to make the nation strong, but they don't want to borrow uncritically. So Liang Qichao travels to America for many months in 1903. And he wants to visit America ostensibly to raise money for his Protect the Emperor Society that he and Kang Youwei are running. But he really wants to see the American experiment. And he's often called the Chinese de Tocqueville, right, after Alexis de Tocqueville. And so he wants to see this industrial powerhouse, but also the political system. And he thinks maybe this could work in China. But what he finds is New York City first. And New York City, he finds a huge stark contrast between the rich and the poor in the Gilded Age. So he finds that 70% of the nation's wealth is held by 0.25% of the population. And so he says, next to these beautiful skyscrapers, you have the ragged and wretched poverty of the slums. He talks about the Italian and Jewish and other ghettos and their mortality rate, the child mortality rate. And he ends with the phrase, when you see stuff like this, you know that we can't avoid socialism. That's his last phrase. He also looks at women and women's suffrage. And so a lot of the earlier Chinese travelers like Guo Songtao had noticed that women were deferred to in British society. People, let them into the car first, they took off their hat, and he thought, they would think, this is gender inversion. This is like the old country of women, right, in the far west. But Liang Qichao, he said, it seems like the ideal of egalitarianism. But if you look deeper, you realize the women have no voice, right? So if you look deeper, they have property rights, but they don't have the right to vote. And so he talks at length about the suffrage movement and which states had already adopted suffrage and the right of women to vote. And he says, even in the states where they were granted the rights, like Wyoming, some of those reversed it. And they gave it up. And he said, they don't understand how valuable this right is. And he was very struck by anti-black racism. So when he was traveling through the South, through New Orleans and other places, he said, the rights of emancipated black people are just in name only. They're not actually free. He said, now they're the collectively owned slaves of the city. He said, black people aren't allowed to leave the city without permission. So how are they not slaves? And he heard about lynching for the first time, and he reported all these incidents of lynching when he was there. And he said, this is a brutal and inhuman practice, inconceivable in a civilized country. And then he compares it to Russia. He said, Russia kills a few hundred or a few dozen Jews. The world considers this an outrage. I don't know which to choose as worse, America or Russia, when talking about lynching. But he was also observing the Chinese populations in Chinatowns, especially San Francisco, which was the biggest. And he was trying to determine whether, since they had the opportunity to have some sort of freedom, how they would act. And he comes out very depressed because he says that, given near complete liberty in San Francisco, these immigrants failed to develop any self-governing institutions. Instead, they reproduced this sort of clannish village mentality of China. So he said, Chinese people can serve as members of a clan, but they cannot become proper citizens. If we were to adopt government by majority rule at this time, it would be like committing national suicide. So he determines that the American experiment grew up organically in the 13 colonies, and it can't be transplanted elsewhere. It just would not work. And so he said his prescription for China was that they needed someone with an iron fist, basically, to reform the country, educate the people, mold them with iron and fire, and then 20, 30, or 50 years, then we can give them Rousseau to read or discuss with them the deeds of George Washington. So the last traveler I'm talking about is Shan Shili. So Shan Shili is a rare figure. So she's a classically trained female scholar, historian. She's the wife of a diplomat who was a Chinese ambassador to Holland and France and Italy, and she traveled with him to Russia first and then to Italy. And so the Qing dynasty is collapsing at this time and is dealing with this power of the West. And she is also, like Liang Qichao, interested in how do we make the nation stronger? How can we save China from being carved up? And so she makes these phrases. She said, the foundation of the nation should be its women. And she said, when a nation's foundation is strong and stable, this is especially connected to its women. And she says, in places like Japan, women take personal responsibility as a citizen of the nation, but Chinese women are caged up at home. They're in a cage, and they basically don't even know that the nation exists. So she advocates for women's education, like Eliza Jane Bridgman, the missionary we had looked at. But she's also a very incisive scholar. So she takes the Trans-Siberian Railway across Russia, traveling from Manchuria to St. Petersburg. And what she notices, she says, it's not just a travel through space, it's like traveling through time. And she adopts this 5 ages theory, which was popular in Europe at the time, to explain the different ages of mankind. And she said, when you start in Siberia, it's like you're in the age of hunting. And then you're on the steppe, it's like the age of pastoralism. And then in places like Ukraine, it's like the age of agriculture. And then as you approach Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's the age of commerce. And then finally, Western Europe is the industrial age. So she said it was like a microcosm going through time, like a time machine traveling across Russia. But one of her most haunting conclusions, she talks about the Jewish ghetto in Rome. So she has a whole section where she gives you the history of the persecution of Jews in Europe. And she ends this with this interesting postscript where she says, I hope my readers, my Chinese readers, shall attentively savor this account, because several hundred years from now, our people may comprehend it only too well. And so she gives them a warning. What would happen if China is carved up, if China has to live under a Western yoke? Look at the Jews. This is what will happen to you. And so she has a warning at the end of her account. So our last traveler is going the other direction, and this is Edgar Snow. So Edgar Snow is an American journalist, and he's been working in China for a number of years, and he is sort of handpicked by the communists to cross the lines into red territory and interview the communist leaders like Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, people like that. And so this is Snow working with this translation team. Now, the account of his interview with Mao Zedong is, I reproduced the entire thing in the book, and I had to find Edgar Snow's daughter, who lives in Switzerland and is very old, and so I had to get permission from her for this one. So that was an interesting treasure hunt. And so he gives this famous account of Mao where he calls him like a Lincoln-esque figure, very lanky, very simple, but he said he's kind of like, he's both sophisticated and crude at the same time. He spends all night reading philosophy, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and yet sometimes he'll just pull down his pants and start looking for lice while other people are in the room, right? So just, he could be very crude, but also very sophisticated. But what he noted was that there was no hero worship built up around him. No one called him the great leader. Everyone just called him the chairman. And he said he never met anyone who didn't admire him. So in many ways, he rehabilitates the image of the early communist leaders who were viewed in the Western press as demons and killers, and humanizes them. And so we know from his own notes that this was a manicured image, that the Communist Party, they knew what he was writing, and they translated it into Chinese first, they edited it, approved it, and then it was translated back into English. So everything he said had been approved for release. And so he did provide the sort of positive spin for the communist movement, and this actually got him in trouble later. So during the McCarthy move, he was forced to move to Switzerland, where I eventually found his daughter, because of what they considered his sort of pro-communist propaganda here. So he talks about the rustic but cultured philosopher living in a cave, and he said he appeared to be quite free from symptoms of megalomania, which changed later, of course. When he wrote the 1968 edition, he changed those words slightly. So he appeared at the time to be free from symptoms of megalomania. And so that is my synopsis of a few of the pairings of the travelers in the